So we've started talking about this idea of Marxism, which views the international system as one in which wealthy states, the core states, the center states, collaborate and work together to exploit poor countries, periphery countries. And this emerged as a theory, as a way of thinking about the international system during a time when colonialism was really in the ascendant. And so I think it's worth talking about some of the sort of historical context that led to Marxist thinkers to view the global system in this way. So at the end of the 19th century, right, so 1800 through to about the start of the 20th century, there was only really a handful of places on the planet that Europeans hadn't managed to settle or colonize, right? So they had set up colonies in the Western Hemisphere and created new Europes in Australia and New Zealand and the southern part of Africa. But sort of that central part of Africa, that most tropical zone, as well as China, were areas that really hadn't yet been fully incorporated into European empires. And so we can see both of those regions, the central tropical part of Africa and then China, going through a process of colonization during the last part of the 19th, turning into the 20th century, and how wealthy, powerful states worked together and collaborated to make that happen, right? And so the scramble, the race of European powers to carve up Central Africa was really set off when King Leopold of Belgium formed a private company, acting not just as King of Belgium, but as a head of a private company that went into what is today the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which at the time was called the Belgian Congo, and set up a new model of colonial administration to extract resources, right? So up until that point, a lot of colonial colonies in Africa had either been New Europes, where Europeans had shown up in large numbers and established sort of settlements and tried to farm, or it had been, we'll have, a post at a coastal city that'll be a transit point for trade. But Leopold did something very different. He went in with essentially mercenaries. They enslaved the local population. They forced them to build infrastructure in terms of rail lines, and they used that enslaved population to mine the country for minerals that then got shipped out and made Leopold and his investors fantastically rich. And so given that Leopold had sort of figured out how to successfully, and if we can talk about one of the most barbaric instances of human brutality in all of human history, from a financial perspective, successful ways to extract wealth from Africa, a whole bunch of interest sort of pours into that central part of Africa. And there's a sense that this could spiral, that we could end up with a conflict. And so European powers actually meet together at a conference in Berlin in 1884 to set up the rules that are going to govern how they carve up Africa. And those rules are the following, right? So you need to first declare that you are taking territory, right? That you're seizing territory. This must be a public declaration made on a map that's shared with everybody else. Secondly, you have to have a presence on the ground, right? So you have to have a flag or a building, or you can't just sort of claim it, you have to be there as well. And thirdly, you have to get the assent of the local leadership, right? And so Europeans began showing up all across the African continent with pieces of paper in English or French or German, trying to get local leaders to sign them, which would then sort of legitimize, at least under the rules of the Berlin Conference, that European powers had dominion in that particular area because they had bothered to work with the local elite to legalize essentially conquest and economic exploitation of a region. So the rules were set, they were done in cooperation, and this carving up of the African continent was done very quickly in a matter of just like 20 years or so, and with very little conflict between European powers over this rapid territorial expansion. A second example of cooperation can be seen in what happens in China. So China is a country, but essentially since Europeans had begun showing up, had been losing control of its ability to police trade. And so European powers have been setting up trading relationships with different cities, getting exclusive access to different ports, and really dominating the economy of China. China had tried to close itself off to European presence once before, and had led to gunships from Britain showing up and forcing China to relent and allow Europeans in. But at the turn of the century, there was popular unrest. And so this was centered in a sort of religious slash martial arts kind of movement that grew into sort of an anti-foreigner uprising. And since it was sort of a martial arts movement, the British called, I guess, kung fu boxing, right? So the Boxer Rebellion is what it came to be known, and large numbers of people storm into the European quarters of major trading cities all across China and put them under siege. And Europeans call home and say, "Oh my gosh, we're under siege. There's angry mobs everywhere that are taking over things. They're burning warehouses and attacking property, and we're losing control here." And you get a international expeditionary force that's assembled, including Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Russia, the United States, and Japan. All of these countries join together, contribute soldiers to a force, go into China, put down the Boxer Rebellion, scatter this sort of anti-foreigner movement to the wind, and then impose on China a new set of policies, what they call an open door policy. China must be open in terms of its markets to the rest of the world. It must allow foreign goods into China, and it has lost control of its economic destiny. So if you think about this for a second, right, this is 1900, and all of the countries that are going to be fighting World War I in about 2 decades, all of them are working together, unified in a military operation to ensure that they have access to markets on the periphery. And so when Marxist scholars look at that, they see very clearly evidence of cooperation amongst the wealthy industrial powers at the expense of periphery countries. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this idea of colonialism and why you might want colonies. Colonialism is using military power, political power, economic power to control the markets and resources of another state, right? So one of the big complaints of the American colonists was that the only way that they could get tea was for that tea to be imported directly from England, right? Because you can only trade with the colonies through the colonial overlord. Currently, the United States has a colony, a protectorate in the form of Puerto Rico. Goods cannot be shipped directly to Puerto Rico. They need to first be shipped to the United States, and only then can be routed to Puerto Rico. This is a pretty standard way of setting up an economic relationship. You control the economy of another state. You control what they can consume. You can control what they produce. You control what they export, and you hopefully set that up in a way that's very beneficial to you, right? So you have a place to ship your manufactured goods. That's great. Colonies are great as a market that has no other alternative but to buy your stuff. They're also great for raw materials. And so European colonial expansion in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s was focused largely on getting access to really cool stuff that the rest of the world had. Things like coffee and tea and rubber and oil and spices, right? So you actually get pepper in your soups and in your foods. Those things are important. But also gold and precious metals, right? So one of the earliest colonial powers out of the gate was Spain, and Spain made a beeline for the tropical parts of the Western Hemisphere, in part because in 1500 metallurgy, there was a belief that gold was found in the center of the earth, and that gold was attracted to heat, where like the center of the earth where it's hot. And if you wanted to get gold to come to the surface, it had to be attracted by the heat of the sun that would pull it to the surface. And so they expected they would find these, gold mines and silver mines in the tropical parts of the Americas. And indeed they did, and found massive, volumes of gold, which they mined and shipped back to the European continent, and really fueled an empire for more than 100 years based on those gold mines, right? That was what you could get from a colony. Everybody else had to settle for getting colonies to produce stuff. And so if you're trying to get your colonies to produce stuff, you have essentially 2 options. One, you could go the route of King Leopold, right? You can enslave and torture and brutalize local population and force them to grow or plant or dig or do whatever you need them to do. That's one option, and that does get used regularly as part of European colonial expansion. The other way to do it is to structure the economy in such a way by manipulating taxes and exchanges so that you get what you want. And so when the British show up in India, They don't do the sort of mass enslavement. Instead, they simply replace the old colonial overlords, right? And so a colonial administrator shows up and takes residence up on the top of the hill where the old sort of overlords had lived, and goes to the locals and say, so we're going to keep things basically the same. You're going to plant in the fields. I'm going to take a share of your crop for administrative purposes. But the thing is, you're growing rice. I don't particularly want rice. I would like to be paid not in rice, but in British pounds. And the locals say, okay, so how do we get British pounds? And the colonial administrator says, well, you get British pounds by selling me what you produce. And they say, oh, okay, so we bring you the rice, you give us the British pounds, we give you the British pounds back for his taxes. Not quite, says the colonial administrator. We would like you to grow tea. I will give you British pounds for tea. And so a portion of food production gets shifted over to cash crop production, because that's what the colonial administrator will buy to get the pounds that can be used to pay the taxes that people need to stay on their land and grow foods, right? So that works for a while. Now, the British colonial administrator controls that exchange. There's only one place to sell tea. That's to the colonial administrator. The colonial administrator gets it at a rock bottom price, and then turns around and sells it on international markets, picking up the markup on that, because folks can't sell directly into the market when they're in a colony. A few years later, food production is slumping, or there's an issue, and the colonial administrator comes back to the local population and says, I don't think this is working for you. You're not able to grow enough food and keep up with the demand for tea. So I think that we need to find a new model. Why don't you stop growing rice and plant in the rest of your fields? Let's do indigo, or we'll do maybe some spices. That would be good. Grow that. And the locals rightly point out, right, I can't eat indigo, I can't live off of spices. But the colonial administrator will say, don't worry. Back in England, we have this thing that's amazing. It's called the turnip. You're going to love the turnip. So here's what's going to happen. You grow all cash crops. You give them to me. I give you pounds. I take pounds for taxes. Then you give me the rest of the pounds, and I'll give you turnips, and that's what you can eat. And so you get a shifting of the economy from, producing food to producing cash crops, and people consuming turnips. Of course, the turnips aren't bought at the rock bottom global price that you can buy turnips at, because nobody really cares to eat turnips. Instead, the colonial administrator buys cheap turnips from England and turns around and sells them to folks in India at a markup, and is able to make profit there as well. And so you've essentially, through a taxation system and controlling that economic relationship, created a situation in which you can turn turnips into cash crops. The effects of that kind of a dynamic are cataclysmic. When the British showed up in India in about 1750, India was roughly 25% of the world's economy. It was roughly 25% of the world's population, but it also had an industrial base in terms of clothing production. It was really second only to China, which was a comparably sized economy. By 1880, India's economy was only 2.8% of the global economy. Now, part of that is that Britain and others industrialized, and so they had rapid economic expansion. They're able to build massive factories and industrialize, in part because of all the wealth that's flowing in from colonial possessions. But none of that industrialization process ends up happening in India. On top of that, India is a humanitarian disaster. By 1880, roughly 8% of the population is literate. There has been essentially no progress in terms of urbanization. People remain in very rural villages, and life expectancy is under 25. That is not a typo. Life expectancy in India is under 25. India becomes synonymous with famines. Famines are a part of life in India, and plague India almost every year that the British are there. The last famine India experiences is in 1950, I believe. The British leave in 1949. So the consequence for India of experiencing this kind of economic control on the part by Britain is a humanitarian cataclysm, a destruction of the population by creating an economy that produces cash crops for consumption in Britain at the expense of the population in India.